Our ability to create and sustain economic growth is the defining challenge of our time. Of course, there are other challenges: healthcare, disease burdens and pandemics, environmental challenges, and of course, radicalized terrorism. However, to the extent that we can actually solve the economic growth challenge, it will take us a long way to solving the challenges that I've just elucidated. More importantly, unless and until we solve economic growth and create a sustainable long-term economic growth, we will be unable to address the seemingly intractable challenges that continue to pervade the globe today, whether it's healthcare, education, or economic development. The fundamental question is this: how are we going to create economic growth in advanced and developed economies like the United States and across Europe at a time when they continue to struggle to create economic growth after the financial crisis? They continue to underperform and to see an erosion in the three key drivers of economic growth: capital, labor, and productivity. In particular, these developed economies continue to see debts and deficits, the decline and erosion of both the quality and quantity of labor, and they also see productivity stalling. In a similar vein, how are we going to create economic growth in the emerging markets, where 90% of the world's population lives and where, on average, 70% of the population is under the age of 25? In these countries, it is essential that they grow at a minimum of 7% a year in order to put a dent in poverty and to double per capita incomes in one generation. And yet, today, the largest emerging economies, countries with at least 50 million people, continue to struggle to reach that 7% magic mark. Worse than that, countries like India, Russia, South Africa, Brazil, and even China are falling below that 7% number, and in many cases, actually regressing. Economic growth matters. With economic growth, countries and societies enter into a virtuous cycle of upward mobility, opportunity, and improved living standards. Without growth, countries contract and atrophy, not just in the annals of economic statistics, but also in the meaning of life and how lives are lived. Economic growth matters powerfully for the individual. If growth wanes, the risk to human progress and the risk of political and social instability rises, and societies become dimmer, coarser, and smaller. The context matters, and countries in emerging markets do not need to grow at the same rates of developed countries. Now, I know some of you in this room find this to be a risky proposition. There are some people here who will turn around and be quite disillusioned by what's happened around the world and basically ascribe that to economic growth. You worry about the overpopulation of the planet. And looking at the UN recent statistics and projections that the world will have 11 billion people on the planet before it plateaus in 2100, you're concerned about what that does to natural resources, arable land, potable water, energy, and minerals. You're also concerned about the degradation of the environment, and you worry about how man, embodied in a corporate globalist, has become greedy and corrupt. But I'm here to tell you today that economic growth has been the backbone of changes moving and living standards of millions of people around the world. And more importantly, it's not just economic growth that has been driven by capitalism. The definition of capitalism, very simply put, is that the factors of production, such as trade and industry, capital and labor, are left in the hands of the private sector and not the state. It's really essential here that we understand that fundamentally the critique is not for economic growth per se, but what has happened to capitalism. And to the extent that we need to create economic growth over the long term, we're going to have to pursue it with a better form of economic stance. Economic growth needs capitalism, but it needs it to work properly. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the core of the capitalist system has been defined by private actors. And even this, however, is a very simplistic dichotomy: capitalism good, non-capitalism bad. When in practical experience, capitalism is much more of a spectrum. And we have countries such as China, which have practiced more state capitalism, and we have countries like the United States, which are more market capitalist.
This 21st century perspective allows you to clearly see that capitalism does not work by effectively allocating existing resources. It works by effectively creating new solutions to human problems. The genius of capitalism is that it is an evolutionary solution-finding system. It rewards people for solving other people's problems. The difference between a poor society and a rich society, obviously, is the degree to which that society has generated solutions in the form of products for its citizens. The sum of the solutions that we have in our society really is our prosperity, and this explains why companies like Google and Amazon and Microsoft and Apple and the entrepreneurs who created those companies have contributed so much to our nation's prosperity. This 21st century perspective also makes clear that what we think of as economic growth is best understood as the rate at which we solve problems. But that rate is totally dependent upon how many problem solvers, diverse, able problem solvers we have, and thus how many of our fellow citizens actively participate, both as entrepreneurs who can offer solutions and as customers who consume them. But this maximizing participation thing doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen by itself. It requires effort and investment, which is why all highly prosperous capitalist democracies are characterized by massive investments in the middle class and the infrastructure that they depend on.
I have started or helped start dozens of companies and initially hired lots of people, but if there was no one around who could afford to buy what we had to sell, all those companies and all those jobs would have evaporated. That's why I can say with confidence that rich people don't create jobs, nor do businesses large or small. Jobs are a consequence of a circle of life-like feedback loop between customers and businesses. And only consumers can set in motion this virtuous cycle of increasing demand and hiring. In this sense, an ordinary consumer is more of a job creator than a capitalist like me.
Just spend a couple of minutes on system dynamics. It's a bit complex, and I apologize for that. What I'll try and do is I'll try and paraphrase it in sort of human terms. So it looks a little bit like this. Firms produce goods for households, that's us, and provide us with incomes, and that's even better because we can spend those incomes on more goods and services. That's called the circular flow of the economy. It looks harmless enough. I want to just highlight one key feature of this system, which is the role of investment. Now, investment constitutes only about a fifth of the national income in most modern economies, but it plays an absolutely vital role. And what it does, essentially, is to stimulate further consumption growth. It does this in a couple of ways, chasing productivity, which drives down prices and encourages us to buy more stuff, but I want to concentrate on the role of investment in seeking out novelty, the production and consumption of novelty. Joseph Schumpeter called this the process of creative destruction. It's the process of the production and reproduction of novelty, continually chasing expanding consumer markets, consumer goods, new consumer goods. And this is where it gets interesting, because it turns out that human beings have something of an appetite for novelty. We love new stuff. New material stuff for sure, but also new ideas, new adventures, new experiences. What we need the economy to do, in fact, is to put investment back into the heart of the model, to reconceive investment. Only now investment isn't going to be about the relentless and mindless pursuit of consumption growth. Investment has to be a different beast. Investment has to be, in the new economy, protecting and nurturing the ecological assets on which our future depends. It has to be about transition. It has to be investing in low-carbon technologies and infrastructures. We have to invest, in fact, in the idea of a meaningful prosperity, providing capabilities for people to flourish. And of course, this task has material dimensions. It would be nonsense to talk about people flourishing if they didn't have food, clothing, and shelter. But it's also clear that prosperity goes beyond this. It has social and psychological aims. Family, friendship, commitment, society, participating in the life of that society. And this, too, requires investment. Investment, for example, in places where we can connect, places where we can participate.